Hey everyone, Kit Saberfang here, the pro wrestling VTuber dedicated to love and justice, wishing you all a safe, happy, and healthy new year. I originally planned to put out a 5 favorite matches of 2024 video similar to what I did last year, but I need to keep it real with y'all. This has been a fairly miserable year for me personally, and I'm having to give myself a bit of grace with this one. I wrote a blog post about what's been going on earlier this month that I'll have linked in full below. I'm pleased to report that my partner is doing great, their chemotherapy treatments have been completed, and we're all hoping for a much better 2025. Though it doesn't really feel too likely considering that we are tragically American, but with any luck, whichever re-education camp that I'm ultimately sent to against my will has Wi-Fi, so I'll at least be able to keep up with TJPW before my bones are eventually harvested to sustain the rich. Holy shit, this is bleak. When I originally started working on that video, however, I realized that one match really stood out above the others when it came to having something to yap about. But before we get to that, here's a quick rundown of some of my other favorite matches of the year. The honorable mentions, if you will. Hyper Misao vs Shoko Nakajima, New Year Make Your Dreams Come True Daruma match from TJPW 2-4. The annual 1v1 showdown between tag team besties did not disappoint, and was my actual favorite match of the year up until the summer. The highlight for me here is Nakajima taking a body slam onto a cement floor covered in plastic kaiju toys, with one of them actually getting stuck in her back. This one's for the love of the game, y'all. Masha Slamovich vs Miyu Yamashita, also from TJPW 2-4. Arguably the best singles match for either competitor all year, a surprisingly physical, hotly contested match. One of my favorites to show people if they want to know what makes Yamashita the true ace of TJPW. Sari and Mayu Iwatani vs Chihiro Hashimoto and Veni from Sariism Chapter 5. Booker, promoter, and wrestler of the year, Sari knocks it out of the fucking park like no other with her Sariism shows. And the Chapter 5 main event delivers with one of the best tag team matches of all time. 4 women hell-bent on killing one another, and none of them are afraid to die. Veni in particular puts in an all-timer performance and is recognized by the Saber Gang for her achievements of excellence in the serving of cup. Mizuki and Haru Kazushiro versus Mei Saruga and the big dog, Uda Takami from TJPW Tokyo Princess Cup Finals. I'm seeing double! 4 Emi Sakuras? It was the brat summer of 2024, and no match better defined this era than the 2 queens of brat style, Mizuki and Mei Saruga, taking their gremlin children in the battle. Star-making performances from the 2 rookies, relentless pacing from start to finish, and just flat out, one of the most fun matches of the year. Emi Sakura vs Shoko Nakajima from Wrestle Princess 5. As one of the biggest Emi Sakura stands there is, I had to include my favorite match from Your Highness's incredible 2024 match catalog, and what a year it's been. Emi and Mizuki vs 1-2 Million versus Mei Saruga at Gato Moves to the Future event, with Chris Brooks against the Magical Sugar Rabbits. Another year of endless bangers from Emi, but it's her 1v1 against Shoko here that stands out for its elegant mix of technique and brutality. Miyu Watanabe vs Ryu Mizunami, also from Wrestle Princess 5. In my estimation, the only wrestlers to possibly have as strong a year as Sari would be Will Ospreay, Shoko Nakajima, and Miyu Watanabe. One of Watanabe's best defenses of the Princess of Princess Championship, and while we'll get to her top match in just a moment, this is the one that truly cemented her reign. Having overcome the pillars of TJPW as its new champion, Watanabe's victory over the previously undefeated Ryu Mizunami is a wildly cathartic moment, with the promise of a new era for TJPW being fulfilled. No one locks in harder than Big Match Miyu. Miyu Watanabe vs Shoko Nakajima from Yes Wonderland 2-4. And this is Miyu's best defense, in case you were wondering. LeBron Cozone vs Speedball Mike Bailey from DPW Super Battle. The best match I saw live this past year. An absolutely star-making performance here from LeBron Cozone. Cozy was already beloved by the DPW crowd, but this bout with Speedball put him over the top and set him up perfectly for his DPW national title win later in the year. Hanan and Saya Ida vs Chanyoda and Mai Sakurai from Stardom at Korakuen Hall, February 17th. Chanyote's the GOAT! 2024 was an unbelievable year for tag team wrestling, easily the best that I can recall in my lifetime. Just about every promotion was putting on tag team bangers, and this New Blood tag team title match deserves to be in that top conversation. Incredibly physical, next level performances from everyone involved. Chanyota in particular puts in an all-timer babyface performance here as the unstoppable juggernaut rookie looks to be breaking down before absolutely crushing Saya Iida with the nastiest headbutt this year. And as you're about to discover, reckless moves like this, no matter how badass, do come with some serious risks.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which suggestions or warnings about events to come are dropped or planted.
One of those matches you can show anyone new to Joshi wrestling, and if they're not screaming their heads off by the end of this thing, then the real just isn't for them. Okay, with the honorable mentions out of the way, let's get to our main event, my favorite match of the year. This was the first match I sat down to write about and found that it came with a lot of complex emotions to sort out, and I hope you come out of it with a better understanding and appreciation for pro wrestling and those who put their lives on the line for our entertainment. Enjoy. Watch pro wrestling for a long enough period of time, and you'll eventually end up with at least one match that, while you may have loved at first, perhaps even thought of as your favorite, but is now uncomfortable to go back and visit for any number of reasons. Whether it's knowing of an injury that occurs during the match that clouds your enjoyment, a bizarre backstage incident later in life that ultimately makes it feel like all that work was for nothing, or perhaps most commonly, the childhood favorite who wound up being one of history's greatest monsters. In the world of pro wrestling, hindsight is a cruel mistress that ultimately makes fools of us all. A perfect example of what I'm talking about here would be the 1999 WWF Championship encounter between Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Mick Foley, aka Mankind, at that year's Royal Rumble pay-per-view, contested under an I Quit match stipulation. The match is set up to be the perfect capstone to a red-hot feud during the single largest boom period the company would ever experience, and with a stipulation that promised violence and carnage during what would also be the bloodiest period in the company's history. And if you look up this match online, you'll see plenty of discussion revolving around its place as one of the greatest matches of its type, as well as it being a pivotal moment in the in-ring career of future megastar Dwayne Johnson. It's considered one of the standout matches of their lengthy feud. It's currently sitting at a respectable 8 out of 10 rating on Cage Match for a 4.9 out of 10 card. Woof. And was heavily featured in the climax of a pro wrestling documentary, which would be released later that year. We'll get to that part in just a moment.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
The 1999 I Quit match, even with its heightened violence and theatrics, doesn't feel particularly out of place for the era when watching it back today. That is, however, until around the 16-minute mark when future Emperor of America, Dick the Cock Johnson, brandishes a pair of handcuffs and restrains Mick Foley's hands behind his back, rendering him completely and utterly defenseless. And following a bit of back and forth in which Mick does manage to stomp Dick's cock square in the Johnson, things take a sudden and disastrous turn. The Rock comes back with an incredibly stiff lariat, proceeds to grab a steel chair, and caps off what had already been a fairly brutal match up until this point by forever changing the hierarchy of Mick Foley's brain cells, brutalizing him with 11 unprotected chair shots directly to Foley's skull. And looking back, this is an already horrifying display of violence on its own, especially considering what we know now about the effects of blunt force head trauma and neurodegenerative diseases such as CTE, which I need not remind you is in fact a real thing whether you believe in it or not. Steve, that's literally the brain damage talking. But the match is made even more miserable upon rewatch when factoring in the independent documentary released later that year, Beyond the Mat, which revealed that this all occurred while his wife and 2 small children were seated in the front row, recoiling together in horror as they collectively experienced the unique trauma of an entire arena screaming with glee as their father's skull is being splayed open like a chocolate Kinder egg for the world to feast upon. A year later, in an interview with ABC News 2020 that has since become lost media, Mick's wife, Colette, would tell reporters, "He's 34 years old, and he moves like an 80-year-old man. His knees can always be replaced and repaired. But this," gesturing towards her head, "short-term memory? Getting lost trying to drive home where he'd lived for years? Numbers are really bad." Only a year removed from the match, and Mick's loved ones are starting to recognize the long-term effects of brain damage. And then there's Dwayne's place in all of this. In later recountings of the match, Mick is consistent in the agreed-upon plan, which originally called for only 5 chair shots, an already gruesome number of times to have a 6'5", 280-pound man swing for the fences and using your head for the ball. But Rocky ultimately gave him 11 full-force, unprotected shots with a steel chair. After the 6th shot to the head, Foley somehow finds the wherewithal to try and feed his back to The Rock, practically begging him to just hit him in the back for once. Instead, he waits until Mick finally turns to see what the holdup is and bashes him in the face for his trouble. And when Mick doesn't turn around the next time, he blindsides him with what ends up being the final blow of the match. Mick would later recount that afterwards in the back, wrestlers poured into the locker room in which he was receiving medical treatment to check in on his well-being and congratulate him on the match. Not among those names was Dwayne Johnson. Mick would most recently speak about the I Quit match in 2023, saying, "I regret that it went overboard and it was excessive. I don't think we need to see that type of match ever again. In some ways, I regret it. I shouldn't have had my kids there." As someone who has a true sicko tolerance for violence in wrestling, I'm good with never seeing this match again, and I can understand even the biggest fans of either of these two not wanting to see it. But that's not actually the match we're talking about here today. Like I said, we all have that one match that can be uncomfortable to go back to, and for me, my beloved cursed match would be 2017's Sakura Genesis encounter between New Japan Pro Wrestling's heavyweight champion Kazuchika Okada and his challenger, the wrestler, Katsuyori Shibata. Prior to this year, I had only seen this match twice, live on the night it took place, and a few days later, having learned what happened to Shibata after the show went off the air. And for 7 years, I held it in my heart as my favorite pro wrestling match of all time, while also never wanting to go back and confirm this truth. For those unfamiliar, New Japan's 2017 Sakura Genesis event was headlined by the IWGP Heavyweight Championship match, one that Katsuyori Shibata had fought for years to achieve. Originally joining NJPW in 1999, Shibata debuted alongside his fellow rookies, Shinsuke Nakamura and Hiroshi Tanahashi, and were soon dubbed the New Three Musketeers by the company, destined to ascend to the top of New Japan, propelling it into a new golden era. This, unfortunately, did not turn out to be the case, as New Japan would suffer a major downturn in business at the turn of the millennium, mostly due to the rise of Pro Wrestling Noah and the new and exciting world of mixed martial arts promotions such as Pride. And while Tanahashi and Nakamura would ultimately weather the storm and become the pillars for the next generation, Shibata would leave New Japan in 2005, opting to try his hand both independently in wrestling and in mixed martial arts. He wouldn't return to New Japan until 2012, 7 years later, and finding his then fellow rookies were now legendarily adored figures at the top of the promotion, and himself being perceived as an outsider who abandoned the company when the going got tough and is only back now that it's a success once more. In the years that followed, Shibata would play the hand he was dealt, grinding his way back through the New Japan Pro Wrestling circuit, slowly building a reputation for being one of its most exciting, hard-nosed ass kickers the promotion has to offer. During a period where guys like Tanahashi and Nakamura were bringing in a whole new age of flash and charisma to New Japan Pro Wrestling, Shibata, in his black boots, black trunks, all-business approach, made him stand out as a throwback to the true era of strong-style wrestling, with all the technique and viciousness to back it up. The turning point for Shibata's New Japan career would come in 2016 at January's Wrestle Kingdom 10 event, where his ongoing rivalry with fellow hardass Tomohiro Ishii over who could absorb the most punishment before their bodies quit for them culminated in Shibata winning his first singles title within the company, the Never Openweight Championship. A title that he would utilize to silence his critics once and for all, that he was committed to New Japan Pro Wrestling, its fans, and he wouldn't be running out again anytime soon. For the rest of the year, Katsuyori Shibata would continue the work of exorcising his past demons by challenging New Japan's legendary second-generation wrestlers. In years prior, Shibata had faced his contemporaries Shinsuke Nakamura and Hiroshi Tanahashi, and, whether begrudgingly or not, had earned their respect in combat. Now it was time to prove his worth to those who had paved the way for their generation, going through the gauntlet of Satoshi Kojima, Hiroshi Tenzen, and Blue Justice, Yuji Nagata. These battles were often heated, borderline disrespectful, and above all, violent. And by the end of the year, one by one, Katsuyori Shibata had earned their respect, and respect had been given in return. Over the course of these 5 years, Shibata had become a reliable, respected pro wrestler who consistently delivered show-stopping bouts, had earned the adoration of the New Japan fans, his contemporaries, and now his seniors. And in 2017, Shibata would win his first singles tournament within the company, the New Japan Cup, affording him the opportunity to challenge for its top title, the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. The hard climb towards the top was reaching its climax, and in a lot of ways, it felt as though the stars had aligned and Shibata was on his way to achieving that ultimate prize. There was just one small problem. The man currently holding the IWGP Heavyweight Championship was Kazuchika Okada, a next-generation wrestler currently in his 4th reign with the top belt and is in full-blown God King Emperor mode on a run that will ultimately stretch more than 700 days in its entirety. None of this matters to the sold-out Ryogoku crowd, because on this night in April of 2017, they came here to see the wrestler win the big one. To discuss this match in length would probably add another 40 minutes to this video's runtime, so let's cut to the chase. 38 minutes of some of the absolute greatest pro wrestling ever committed to the ring. Sublime camera work and storytelling that are still lauded to this day, a fired up crowd there for every strike and counter, just some of the most intense, cerebral, and dramatic action you'll ever see within the squared circle. If you haven't seen Katsuyori Shibata versus Kazuchika Okada at Sakura Genesis 2017, you've got to track it down. No mid-video setup blurb can do it justice. But just a word of warning, and here's where we finally pump the brakes on everything I've said about it thus far. Around 31 minutes into the fight, having absorbed Okada's attempt at a kill shot and smelling blood in the water, Shibata pulls Okada back up to his feet and crushes him with a headbutt that lands with a thudding clunk, sending chills throughout the arena. As Shibata stands, slumped in recovery, he pulls his head back to receive the crowd, and a stream of blood trickles down his face. And for these 5 seconds, Katsuyori Shibata is a god. Unfortunately though, for Shibata, playing god for 5 seconds, that's easy. But when you're Kazuchika Okada, it just comes naturally. Okada would ultimately defeat Shibata here, and if the devastating headbutt wasn't enough, it's what happens after the match that makes it all the more difficult to return to. As Okada comes to his senses in the ring, having only just survived his latest defense, it's Shibata who is genuinely fighting for his life. Struggling to stay on his feet, wandering about in a daze, all while waving off the ringside crew trying to help, one could look at this and think, wow, what a masterclass in selling the effects of such an extraordinarily hard-fought battle. But as we'd later find out, this was a man suffering from a subdural hematoma, and combined with the severe dehydration of having wrestled an extremely intense 40-minute match, was experiencing increasing paralysis along the right side of his body. Shibata would be rushed to a nearby hospital and undergo emergency brain surgery to relieve the excessive bleeding and pressure forming inside of his skull. Wrestling historian Dave Meltzer would famously report this surgery required his brain to be removed entirely from his skull and placed back in again, which, in the very least, gave us something to laugh about amidst the horror of learning that one of the greatest wrestlers who's ever lived may have just given their life to the sport. For those of us overseas, this was all incredibly shocking news at the time. As for myself, the match ended sometime around 3 a.m., and if you've ever stood up that late to watch any type of event or midnight movie release, it's an easy bet to say that I crashed immediately after the show. I went to bed having felt like I had just witnessed the greatest pro wrestling match I'd ever seen in my life, and woke up to the news that now not only is one of them in the hospital, but it wasn't clear whether or not they survive. A few days later, New Japan Pro Wrestling released a statement that clarified Shibata's condition, and that he was in fact expected to recover. And so I decided to give the match another watch, still buzzing over just how incredible a contest it was, until it was time to relive the headbutt, and the clunking sound of Shibata's skull cracking against Okada's instantly connected with the pit of my stomach. I found myself unable to focus on the rest of the match, thinking only of Shibata's condition, how his love of shoot headbutts had finally caught up to him, and when the bell rang to signal its end, I quickly turned it off, not wanting to see his eventual, desperate crawl to the back. And I hadn't been able to bring myself to watch it ever since. That was, however, until this past September. TAKAYAMANIA Empire are a series of independent pro wrestling shows produced by legendary wrestler and fan favorite murder grandpa Minoru Suzuki. They're named after fellow wrestling legend and MMA fighter Yoshihiro Takayama, and done so for his benefit. If the name Yoshihiro Takayama isn't a familiar one, you've probably at least seen this clip of him and Don Fry from a Pride event in 2002, punching the ever-living dog piss out of one another in a spectacle regarded as one of the greatest moments in mixed martial arts. Takayama is 6'7", 250 pounds, a student of All Japan's Giant Baba, and one of the preeminent ass kickers of his generation. One of the toughest tough men to ever step foot in the ring, and who'd hold top championships in All Japan, Pro Wrestling Noah, New Japan Pro Wrestling, and DDT Pro. Unfortunately, when I said these events were held for his benefit, it's because Takayama is currently paralyzed from the shoulders down. While competing for DDT Pro in 2017, Yoshihiro Takayama was injured while performing a sunset flip, a move that most wrestling fans wouldn't consider to be particularly dangerous, but as it is in pro wrestling, such is the cost of making everything look easy. Everything involved in pro wrestling is dangerous to some degree, and any move can be life-altering if performed incorrectly. This devastating injury to Takayama came only 1 month after Shibata had found themselves with a life-threatening injury of their own, both of whom were never expected to fully recover from their respective conditions. In the months that followed, Minoru Suzuki, in cooperation with DDT Pro, would launch the TAKAYAMANIA Foundation as a way to assist Takayama's family with his ongoing medical expenses. Suzuki managed to gain the cooperation of every major Japanese promotion to allow for donation boxes to be set up at all pro wrestling events, a practice that continues to this day, along with Suzuki's own ongoing Takayama charity merchandise efforts, as well as the Takayama Empire benefit events. So it's all very poetic that this year's TAKAYAMANIA Empire 3 event was headlined by an unexpected bout, Minoru Suzuki versus Katsuyori Shibata, a man who once clung to life and was told he'd never step foot in a wrestling ring again, taking on a man fighting for the honor and to preserve the memory of a close friend who wasn't as fortunate. For Suzuki, it's about connecting the past, present, and futures of pro wrestling and igniting that fire in Takayama's name. And for Shibata, it's a full circle moment in a winding career. You see, in the years following his injury, Katsuyori Shibata did eventually find his way back into the squared circle, although the path he took to get there wouldn't be so straightforward. Shibata would take up the behind-the-scenes position as head trainer of New Japan's LA Dojo, and at the 2021 G1 Climax Finals, he'd participate in a surprise 5-minute UWF rules match against Zack Sabre Jr., a more or less pure mat wrestling match with no strikes. And in January of 2022, he'd have his first official match at Wrestle Kingdom 16 against the young lion of his own training, Ren Narita, in what was announced as a catch wrestling rules match in which strikes would again not be allowed. Once in the ring, however, Shibata grabbed the microphone and basically said, "Fuck that, we ball," and proceeded to have a quick and intense match with his young protege, strikes and all. By the end of the year, Shibata would leave New Japan Pro Wrestling and sign with the US promotion All Elite Wrestling, where he's been ever since. With New Japan Pro Wrestling showing an unwillingness to allow Shibata to perform in their ring, most likely due to insurance reasons, which is unfortunate but understandable, the idea of Shibata returning to Japan for a major match has felt unlikely. But at one point, so did seeing him back in the ring as a full-time wrestler. And here we are. Katsuyori Shibata has been a full-time wrestler again for 2 years now, and at TAKAYAMANIA Empire, he's making his return to historic Korakuen Hall for the first time in 7 years, to face an opponent he last encountered the same number of years ago. As a longtime Shibata fan, I can't help but share in his emotions, eyes wrapped in tears as he makes his way into the ring. It's an incredibly emotional moment, the crowd coming alive for his every action. If Shibata had any lingering doubts as to whether or not he was missed by fans of his native Japan, this crowd soundly crushed any of those fears. The 27-minute match that follows is incredibly fun and one that reminds you of just how great this goofy-ass sport can be when you allow yourself to have some fun with it. Roughly 23 minutes of this 27-minute bout are dedicated solely to chops as Suzuki goads Shibata into stalking him throughout Korakuen Hall in something of an ode to the legendary chop battle between Kensuke Sasaki and Kenta Kobashi, the latter of whom just so happens to be watching along on commentary. This is no exaggeration either, as my partner and I teamed up to count, and Minoru Suzuki connects 98 chops to Shibata's 126. And probably a third of those by Suzuki were aimed directly at Shibata's throat, which adds a whole new level of sickness to Suzuki's game that I wasn't even aware existed. Eventually, their Korakuen Hall escapade makes its way to that very commentary table, and at the feet of one of the greatest pro wrestlers to ever live, Kenta Kobashi, a man who knows a thing or two about how to deliver a blistering chop. He also knows what it's like to face the life and death realities of pro wrestling, having fought to return to the ring himself following a battle with cancer, and having been a close friend to the late great Mitsuharu Misawa. After delivering some brutal chops to Suzuki, Shibata offers himself to the pro wrestling god, who responds in kind by also chopping him directly in the throat. What a fucking pro. Young boyed his ass so good here. And it's afterwards in this moment, having crumpled two of the toughest active wrestlers today with a set of chops, that he surveys the crowd, showering him once more in a familiar, deafening chant. And with a glimmer in his eye, Kenta Kobashi remembers exactly who the fuck he is. Following the match and its festivities, Minoru Suzuki surprised the crowd and brings out a special guest, the big man himself, Yoshihiro Takayama, making his first public appearance since their life-changing injury those 7 long years ago. The ovation he receives from the crowd here is thunderous, and with some assistance in the ring, Suzuki reveals his true intentions to the audience. He wants to have a wrestling match with his dear friend. As the match is officially declared and the competitors take their positions, an overwhelming surge of energy pours from the crowd, crying out Takayama's name. The production in this moment deserves some recognition as well, with the traditional match start crash zooms signaling to the audience at home the authenticity of Suzuki's challenge. Suzuki stares down his friend, barely able to contain his emotions while channeling everything he has into his fighting spirit. He provokes Takayama, begging his friend to stand up and kick him in the face, to become the emperor once more. But for as much as Takayama fights and struggles within the confines of his wheelchair, the unfortunate reality is that he simply can't. The mind and the spirit are more than willing, but his body is simply too broken to respond. And as tears stream down the competitors' faces, Suzuki calls off the match in a draw, telling his friend that as the king of pro wrestling, he'll wait until he returns to challenge him. As Suzuki approaches Takayama and his hard-as-nails demeanor fades into a gentle smile, he takes a moment to comfort his friend, having just delivered him a precious gift, the feeling of what it's like to be a pro wrestler once more. The story of these men, what they've endured, their triumphs, their tragedies, this is what makes pro wrestling special. People of all walks of life and backgrounds, sacrificing everything for their passions, putting their lives on the line for the sake of entertainment, telling their stories through physical conflict and in ways that both blend and transcend the realities both in front and beyond the camera's eye. 100 failed Hollywood writers at 100 keyboards couldn't create this kind of magic in 100 years. Nothing so manufactured could ever match the true spirit and connection of the human experience. This past year, we saw the celebrated retirements of Sting, Bryan Danielson, and now Kakuta, and the wrestling retirements will continue in 2025 with the already announced final dates for Meiko Satomura, Sumi Sakai, Hiroshi Tanahashi, and John Cena. There were also a number of forced retirements of wrestlers taken from the ring in their prime due to injuries, such as Edith Surreal, Sawyer Wreck, Alex Coughlin, and Chris Bay. It also, unfortunately, wouldn't be a year in pro wrestling without some who left us entirely, with actress girls Asahi passing away at only 21 years old. At any point in any match, something can go wrong. Someone can get hurt. Someone may not be with us for the next show. This is the unfortunate realities of life and pro wrestling. But that's not to say we should have a bleak outlook on a sport that already has enough twisted tales to fill multiple seasons of a show called The Dark Side of the Ring. Instead, it's a call to appreciate your favorite pro wrestlers in the here and now, and to show them love and appreciation with all your heart. These talents are precious, and you just never know when you got to witness their greatness for the last time. For 7 years, I felt I couldn't go back and watch what I felt was the greatest pro wrestling match I'd ever witnessed, and for a number of reasons. Not wanting to see a wrestler I care for recklessly injure themselves, the guilt I felt about still enjoying it despite costing Shibata everything at the time. But seeing Shibata, Suzuki, and Takayama all in the ring together made me appreciate what we have now and how much worse it all could have been. Katsuyori Shibata is still here. He's still the wrestler. And for the past 2 years, he's been wrestling his ass off. The Sakura Genesis 2017 match may have taken him away from the ring, but it wasn't forever, and his heart still pumps with fighting spirit. So when I watch it back today, I can do so with the relief that it wasn't the end. The headbutt is still nasty and stupid, and I wish Chan Yoda hadn't done a similar one earlier this year. But this is also the cost of allowing others to be fully expressive with their art. Everything in pro wrestling is dangerous to a certain degree, and any move can be life-altering. So let's all appreciate our favorite wrestlers in the here and now, because we simply never know when it can be their last time in the ring. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video, and congratulations on making it to 2025. You, my friend, are a real one. Sure, there are no jetpacks or flying cars, but hey, at least you're alive during Miyu Watanabe's Princess Apprentice Championship run. Thank you all for your support throughout this year, and remember, pro wrestling is for everyone, and pro wrestling can be anything.